He opened the trunk and found a second license plate, different number, same model, same year, and suddenly, nothing made sense. The woman he buried shared everything, except this car, this key, and the secret that's about to unmake his entire life. Beneath the seat was a photo of her, with a man he never knew, holding a child he's never met. Now the boy next door knows more than he should, and someone is willing to kill to keep him silent. If he turns the ignition one more time, he might not come back. Archie, who swore he'd buried every secret, couldn't yet know the trunk still carried something more dangerous than memory. It carried evidence. Dex, who turned the key without fear, had no idea that one twist would alert the only man Mildred ever truly feared. And somewhere, far from Elk Pine, a figure watched the road, because the Bel Air was never just a car. It was the last proof of what they did. It all started with a warm breeze drifting across the high plains of Montana, carrying with it the scent of wheat fields and far-off rain, the kind of breeze that reminded a man he was still alive, even if nobody seemed to notice anymore. There, on the cracked edge of Highway 87, about 7 miles east of Winslow, lay the skeleton of a Chevy Bel Air, a forgotten relic that had sunk halfway into the dirt like a memory too stubborn to fade, its hood pried open like a question nobody wanted to answer. People passed it every day, trucks with mud-splattered bumpers, old farmers heading home from feed stores, teenagers who'd never driven anything without a Bluetooth speaker, but none of them slowed down, none of them cared, and none of them saw it for what it really was. That is, until the morning Archibald Miller, known around Clarksfield simply as Archie the Clockman, took his usual route past the field with his German shepherd, Bruno, trailing just a few steps behind, like a shadow that had grown old with him. Archie didn't walk fast, not anymore, but there was a kind of rhythm in the way he moved, like the slow ticking of a grandfather clock that knows it's not in any rush to count the final hours. And that morning, just as the sky was turning the color of cold steel and the sun was deciding whether to show up at all, Archie stopped walking, tilted his head ever so slightly, and looked long at that broken frame of metal and rust. It wasn't the kind of stop you make out of curiosity. It was the kind of stop you make when a face in the crowd suddenly turns familiar, and your heart skips not because of fear, but because of memory. There was something in the curve of the roofline, in the angle of the tail fin, even in the faded turquoise that peeked through layers of brown decay. Something that pulled at a string deep in Archie's chest, the kind of string that hadn't been tugged in decades. Bruno sat beside him, ears up, nose twitching in the wind, as if he too sensed that this moment wasn't just about an old car abandoned in a Montana field. It was about something coming back to life. Archie stepped through the tall grass with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew not to rush when confronting ghosts. And as he placed a hand on the car's sun-baked roof, his breath caught, not from the heat, but from a memory too sharp to ignore. Back in 1964, a car just like this one had rumbled down Route 93 with the top down, the radio playing Sam Cooke, and a woman with red hair laughing beside him as if the whole world had been created just for that ride. For a long while, Archie just stood there, his hand on that car, and if anyone had driven by in that moment, they might have thought he was a man taking a break, or maybe saying goodbye, but really, he was making a decision. He turned to Bruno and said, almost under his breath, "She always said we should have kept that car." And in that instant, something like a spark flickered behind his eyes, the kind of spark that doesn't belong in a man who has buried both his wife and most of his ambition. The next day, the car was gone from the field, and by the following Thursday, it had appeared in Archie's driveway like a question waiting to be answered, the rusted frame sitting proud in front of a garage that hadn't been opened since Gerald Ford was president. And when the neighbors saw it, when they saw Archie dragging out oil-stained tarps, dust-covered socket wrenches, and a shop manual older than most of the town, they did what people always do when they see an old man trying something new. They shook their heads and made bets he'd never finish. But Archie didn't hear them, didn't even care, because for the first time in a long while, he was listening to something else entirely. He was listening to that ticking inside his chest, growing louder, more certain, more alive. And as the last of the sunlight dipped behind the ridge and Bruno settled into his usual spot by the porch, Archie opened the glove box out of nothing but habit and paused, eyes narrowing, because inside, beneath a pile of brittle leaves, was something he hadn't expected to find. It was a folded piece of newspaper, dated July 1964, and wrapped around a metal key with faded turquoise paint still clinging to its edge, a key that shouldn't have been there, not in this car, not after all these years. Archie looked at Bruno, then back at the key, and said the one thing that had been circling his mind since that morning on the highway, the one question he could no longer ignore. Bruno, how the hell did this car end up back in my life? Bruno didn't answer with words, of course, just let out a slow, deliberate sigh the way old dogs do when the world changes without asking their permission, and padded over to sit by the garage door. As if somehow he already knew the answer Archie hadn't quite found yet. The truth, Archie realized, was that some things don't come back by chance, and that car, that exact car, wasn't just rust and nostalgia wrapped in turquoise paint and regret. It had returned with purpose, like something unfinished had circled back around, still waiting to be done right. Inside the glove box, beneath that folded newspaper and time-worn key, was a crumpled matchbook from a roadside diner just south of Great Falls. The kind that went belly up in the late 70s when the interstate started swallowing small dreams and spitting out empty buildings. And that matchbook, it still carried the faintest scent of cigarette smoke and vanilla pie, a ghost of long-lost evenings Archie hadn't remembered in years, but now felt again in the back of his throat like a name you don't dare say out loud. He stood there a while, hands still inside the glove box, staring at the garage that had become more storage than sanctuary over the last few decades, its shelves lined with broken clocks, cracked lanterns, and a single bottle of bourbon that had survived every winter since 1983. When he finally opened that garage door, the hinges screamed in protest like they were waking from a bad dream, and the light that spilled in revealed a workbench layered with sawdust, memories, and tools that still held the warmth of hands long gone. For the next few hours, and maybe for the first time since Mildred's funeral, Archie didn't think about the past as something he'd lost, but rather as something that might still have something left to teach him, if only he paid attention closely enough. The body of the Bel Air was worse than he'd hoped but better than he'd feared, panels eaten by rust, seats ravaged by mice, but under all that decay, the frame held firm, like the spine of an old soldier who still stood at attention when duty called. Neighbors slowed their cars when they passed, drawn by the sight of a man in a denim apron hauling out ancient socket wrenches and wheel jacks that hadn't rolled in decades, while Bruno kept watch on the porch with eyes that missed nothing and forgave everything. They didn't understand what Archie was doing, not really, because most folks these days thought fixing meant replacing, and they couldn't see the difference between a project and a promise, between junk and a vow still waiting to be kept. Around the second week, the boy from next door started showing up, just standing there at first, arms crossed, trying to pretend like he didn't care, but curiosity always has a way of prying loose the latches we bolt shut too young. His name was Dexter, Dex for short, and he was the kind of kid who kept his earbuds in even when they weren't playing anything, because silence made him uncomfortable and grown-ups always asked too many questions. But that afternoon, as Archie struggled to loosen a bolt that had rusted itself shut like it had something to hide, Dex finally broke the silence, not with small talk, but with a question that came out more serious than he intended. "Mr. Miller, why this car?" Archie didn't look up right away, just kept his hand on the wrench like the question deserved more than a quick answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice had that weight to it, the kind that tells you a story's about to begin, whether you're ready or not. "Well," Archie said, slow and steady, "because once, a long time ago, I left something behind in a car just like this, and I think maybe, after all these years, it came back to ask me why." Dex didn't laugh, didn't scoff, just nodded the way someone does when they hear something that hits deeper than it should, and from that day on, he kept coming back, not because he liked old cars, but because he knew there was more to that answer. Each time Dex showed up, Archie gave him something small to do, sorting bolts by size, sanding down a patch of rust, holding the flashlight steady, and with every task, Archie wasn't just teaching him tools, he was teaching him something quieter, something slower, something that didn't come with instructions. But one afternoon, just as they were stripping the door panels, Dex held up a thin scrap of paper tucked behind the lining, yellowed and torn, but unmistakably old, and asked, puzzled and hesitant, "Mr. Miller, did you put this here?" Archie took the paper from Dex's hand with the same care you'd used to hold an old photograph, one where the faces have faded but the feeling still burns beneath the surface, stubborn as coal under ash. "No, son," he said, eyes narrowing not from suspicion but from that slow, gathering tension that comes when the past begins to stir on its own. "I didn't put this here, but I remember the handwriting." The boy leaned closer as Archie unfolded the paper slowly, carefully, as if he feared the wrong move might erase whatever story had clung to it all those years, tucked away inside the skin of a forgotten door. It wasn't a letter, not exactly, but more like a note you write when you know the words are only for one person, and that person already understands more than the ink could say. Short, plain, and written in the clean loops of a woman who had taken shorthand in high school. Don't forget to pack the maps. I left them in the glove box. Love, M. Archie stared at the note like it was some kind of mirror, showing him not his reflection, but a version of himself that used to exist, a man leaning against a Bel Air with his boots in the dust and his heart in the front seat. He didn't speak for a long while, and Dex didn't push, because some silences carry more meaning than words ever could, and even the dog, Bruno, shifted his weight without a sound, watching them both with that knowing stillness only age can earn. Finally, Archie folded the note again, slower this time, and tucked it into the pocket of his work shirt, where it rested just over the place his heart used to beat a little faster every time Mildred laughed. This wasn't just a car, he said softly, voice catching like gravel beneath worn tires. This was the place we were gonna start over, just her and me, up north near the border where the trees don't stop for miles. Dex nodded, not because he knew what that felt like, but because he could sense, deep down, that this wasn't about road trips or maps. It was about something promised, and something left behind. For the rest of that day, they didn't speak much, just worked in that companionable quiet that happens when hands are busy and minds are remembering, the kind of rhythm that hums between generations when nobody's trying too hard to explain themselves. By early evening, they'd stripped down the interior, revealing not just metal and wiring, but something else, something that felt like the bones of a story not yet finished, waiting patiently beneath years of rust for the right hands to bring it back. But as the sun dipped low behind the grain silos and Bruno barked once toward the driveway, a figure appeared in the distance, slow, deliberate, walking like he knew exactly where he was going and why it mattered. He was tall, even in old age, wore a hat too clean for farm work and boots too quiet for bluff. And as he stepped into the light near the garage, Archie froze, like he'd seen a photograph come to life. "Dex," Archie said, not taking his eyes off the man. "Go inside and fetch the photo from the mantel, the one in the silver frame, by the clock." Dex hesitated, but something in Archie's tone, low, steady, almost reverent, told him this wasn't just a request. It was part of something bigger, something delicate, like the truth just barely holding its breath. And as Dex ran inside, the man in the hat stopped just shy of the driveway and removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes the color of old cedarwood, and a face that Archie hadn't seen in over 40 years. "Arch," the man said, voice raspy but familiar like a vinyl record you'd forgotten you owned. "That car still giving you trouble?" Archie swallowed hard, the kind of swallow that carries more than words. It carried history, grief, and something else too. The unmistakable sense that a chapter thought closed had just been pried back open. "Depends," Archie replied, narrowing his eyes. "Are you here to finish what we started, or to finally tell me why you disappeared?" The man in the hat didn't flinch at Archie's question, just stood there with the weight of time hanging on his shoulders like an old coat he hadn't taken off in decades, his eyes scanning the Bel Air like it was both a monument and a confession. "I came back," he said finally, voice low and slow like thunder rolling far out over empty land, "because the truth don't stay buried forever, and neither do promises." Dex returned just then, the silver-framed photo clutched tight in his hand, and Archie took it without looking, eyes still locked on the man before him, the same man who had once been his closest friend, his best man, and the keeper of a secret too heavy to carry alone. He held up the photo, not to the man, but to the light, letting the setting sun catch on the glass, and there they were, frozen in time, Archie, Mildred, and the man in the hat, standing in front of that very same Bel Air, smiling like the future belonged to them. "That picture was taken 3 days before you vanished," Archie said, voice quieter now, like something inside him had shifted from anger to ache. "And for 43 years, I've wondered if I'd ever get the reason why." The man stepped forward, slowly, like each footfall carried the weight of a chapter too long unread, and he reached into his coat pocket to pull out something wrapped in cloth, something flat and rectangular, about the size of a diary. He handed it to Archie without a word, and as Archie unwrapped the fabric, he found a small leather-bound journal, its corners frayed, its spine cracked, and a name stamped faintly in the lower corner, Mildred E. Miller. For a moment, the air between them went still, like the very earth was holding its breath, waiting to see if old wounds might open or finally start to heal. Archie opened the journal, flipping past the first few pages until he found an entry written just a week before their planned trip north. And as his eyes scanned the familiar handwriting, he felt the ground shift beneath him in a way he hadn't expected. Mildred had written about someone visiting her while Archie was away, someone bringing news, a warning, and a truth she hadn't shared, not out of fear, but to protect something larger than either of them had realized at the time. The man nodded slowly, as if he already knew Archie had reached the passage that changed everything, and said, "She asked me not to say anything. Arch said if you knew, you'd give up the whole trip, the dream, the new life." Archie looked up, eyes stormy now, and asked, "And what about you? Why didn't you come back after she passed? Why stay gone after all that?" The man looked down at his boots, scuffed and worn like the trail he'd taken to get there, and said, "Because I made her a second promise, to watch from a distance, make sure you stayed standing, even if I had to do it from the shadows." Dex didn't understand all of it. How could he? But he felt the tension in the air, the kind that only comes when two men stand on the edge of unfinished business, and one of them holds the map back to a road thought lost. That night, the three of them sat in the garage, under a single hanging bulb that swayed with the breeze, and they read through the journal together, page by page, word by word, like monks deciphering scripture not meant for ordinary eyes. In those pages, they found not just memories, but instructions, hints about the car, references to a hidden compartment, notes about the trip they never took, and a list of people Mildred had met near the border who knew the truth. And right there, near the end of the book, in a hurried scrawl that shook with emotion, was a line neither man expected. "If anything ever happens to me, he'll know what to do." He always knew. Archie looked up from the journal, eyes glassy but steady, and asked the one question he'd never dared to voice until that moment. "So tell me, what exactly did she mean by the truth, and who were those people in British Columbia?" The man didn't answer right away, just leaned back in the folding chair like the question itself carried the chill of unfinished stories, the kind that haunt backroads and echo in the bones long after the last tire track fades from view. He ran a hand over his face, fingers lingering at his jawline like he was touching something that hurt, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, more careful now, like he was peeling back a part of history that still had teeth. Mildred was writing to someone, he began slowly, someone she met during the war years, a woman who worked with displaced families, people who had crossed borders with names they couldn't pronounce anymore and stories they weren't allowed to tell. Archie frowned, the journal still open in his lap, and looked down at a small map scribbled in the margin, half a route, a circled town name near the edge of British Columbia, and a single word written beside it in Mildred's sharp, fast script: sanctuary. She said she met her at a hospital near Spokane in '43, the man continued, back when Mildred was volunteering nights, patching up boys younger than her baby brother, some of them with wounds they didn't have names for yet. Archie's grip on the book tightened just slightly, not out of fear, but something closer to reverence, like he was holding the last part of her he hadn't already memorized, and now finding out that even that part had secrets folded deep within it. "Turns out," the man said, voice settling into something firmer now, "that woman, Anna was her name, kept in touch all through the years, sent letters under fake names, codes in the margins, the kind of stuff Mildred kept from you because she didn't want you involved." Dex sat silently nearby, eyes wide, absorbing the story like a sponge in a dry well, realizing that what he thought was just an old man fixing a car had become something much deeper, more like uncovering a time capsule of love and duty and quiet defiance. Archie's eyes flicked back to the car, and suddenly he stood, as if something had clicked into place not in his head, but in his gut, the kind of knowing that comes from instinct honed over decades, from listening to silence long enough to hear what it's really saying. He walked to the Bel Air, placed his hand beneath the driver's seat, and after a few moments of scraping against rust and time, he pulled out a thin, rectangular object wrapped in waxed paper and tied with an old shoelace that had nearly fused to the metal. Bruno barked once, not out of surprise, but like he recognized something in the moment that confirmed what his senses had already suspected, that something sacred had just shifted in the room. Archie opened the bundle with a reverence more fitting for church than a garage, and inside was a metal license plate. Montana issue, rusted and bent, but stamped with the year 1964, the very same year Mildred had scribbled in the journal's margin. On the back, in faded ink barely visible against the oxidation, was a name neither Archie nor Dex recognized: Elias Norcross, Elk Pine Station. Who the hell is Norcross? Archie whispered, his voice just barely above breath, and the man in the chair leaned forward, elbows on knees, mouth set in a line that carried both regret and resolution. "He's the one Mildred was trying to find," he said quietly. "The one who knew what happened in 44, the one with the files they tried to burn." There was silence then, the heavy kind, the kind that settles over a room like dust when truth finally shows its face, and everybody's still trying to decide whether to run or listen. Archie turned to Dex, his eyes clear and steady now, and asked the next question that needed asking, not because he expected an answer, but because it was time to ask it out loud. "You still want to learn, kid? Because if we're going up to Elk Pine, this isn't just about a car anymore." Dexter didn't hesitate, not even for a heartbeat, just nodded with a kind of quiet resolve that only comes when a boy realizes he's being invited not just into a story, but into a legacy, one that had been patiently waiting for a new pair of hands and an open heart. "Yes, sir," he said softly, but the weight behind those two words made Archie pause, because it wasn't the kind of answer you give to a simple offer. It was the kind that accepts a burden and shoulders it like a man grown before his time. The man in the chair watched the exchange with a faint, knowing smile, like he was seeing something unfold that had taken years to ripen, something not even Mildred could have predicted, though she'd certainly planted the seeds. Archie put a hand on Dex's shoulder, a rough hand, one that carried the calluses of time and memory, and gave it the gentlest squeeze, the kind of squeeze that says, "You're not alone in this, not anymore." They spent the rest of that evening laying out a plan, not drawn on paper, but spoken in soft tones under that swaying garage light, like strategists around a war table, trying to decide not just the route ahead, but the soul of the journey itself. Elk Pine wasn't on any current map, not under that name anyway. It was one of those ghost towns that had slipped through the cracks of time, the kind that locals barely remember and the government pretends never existed. The journal offered clues, scattered like breadcrumbs, references to a supply depot hidden near a firewatch station, a hand-drawn star beside a lake that no longer showed on official records, and a note from Mildred that simply read, "He'll remember the sound of Sam Cooke." Dex, who had once thought of history as just dates on a quiz and faded black and white photos in school textbooks, now found himself poring over old maps and repair manuals like a detective, each discovery pulling him deeper into the gravity of something real and unfinished. One morning, while cleaning out the trunk of the Bel Air, Dex uncovered a small, tin tobacco box wedged behind the wheel well, its latch rusted shut, its surface stained with oil and time, but its contents perfectly preserved. Inside was a faded Polaroid, one that had clearly been kept hidden on purpose. Archie and Mildred, arm in arm, standing in front of a building with a chipped sign that read Northline Post 47, and behind them, just barely visible, was the silhouette of another man, a man who looked very much like the one sitting in Archie's garage not 3 days ago. Archie turned the photo over and read the words written in Mildred's neat cursive, Spring 64. Before the lie unraveled, he stared at that line for a long time, longer than the boy could understand, because the weight of those words didn't just carry the past, they threatened to reshape it. Dex leaned in, careful not to break the moment, and asked quietly, what lie was she talking about? Archie let out a long breath, the kind that tastes like dust and grief, and said, "Back then, there were things the government buried so deep, even the people digging forgot what they were looking for." That night, Archie sat Dex down on the porch swing, the old one that had held quiet conversations and tougher confessions over the years, and gave him a lesson no manual could teach. "Son," he said, voice soft but steady, "you fix an engine by understanding how it was built, not by guessing what went wrong. The same goes for people and for truth. You want to uncover something real, you start by listening to what they didn't say." The boy nodded, slower this time, like the lesson was finally sinking through the noise of the world he'd grown up in, one of fast answers and faster exits, and into something quieter, more enduring. And just as the moon rose over the edge of the pines, casting long shadows across the gravel, Dex stood and asked the question Archie hadn't expected from someone so young, but maybe had been needing to hear all the same. "Mr. Miller, if the Bel Air came back to you now, after all these years, do you think she meant for it to?" Archie didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because some truths are so deep they can only be felt before they're spoken, like the sound of a heartbeat under layers of silence, pulsing steady and low, waiting to be heard. He looked at the boy, his young face half-lit by porch light and half-shadowed by wonder, and said with a quiet certainty that came not from guessing, but from living, "I think she never expected the car to come back, but I believe she hoped someone would find it when the time was right." It was the kind of statement that doesn't ask for understanding, it simply waits for it, patient as old pine trees, and wore letters that were never sent. That next morning, just as the sky began to bleed soft gold across the prairie, Archie wheeled the Bel Air out into the sunlight like a man offering something sacred to the day, its shell still rough in places, but with new bolts shining like promise against old steel. The engine hadn't yet turned over, but something in the air felt charged, like the moment before a symphony begins, when the audience holds its breath and every musician waits for the downbeat. They had found the parts in Idaho, buried deep in the backroom of a shop run by a veteran who spoke more with his eyes than with his mouth, a man who had once served with Elias Norcross, though he claimed not to remember the name until he saw Archie's hands. It took 2 weeks, 3 cracked knuckles, and a busted hoist chain. But when Archie and Dex finally lowered the new engine into place, something shifted in the way the house felt. As if the structure itself understood that some part of the past was being set back into order. That afternoon, the man in the hat returned, not to talk, not to confess, but to help, the way old friends sometimes do when words have all been said and only labor remains to close the distance. They worked side by side, Archie and the man who'd once vanished without a trace, the rhythm of their tools echoing like old jazz, improvised, imperfect, but always finding the right notes in the end. And then, on a Sunday morning, just before church bells rang out from a town that had mostly stopped listening, Archie sat behind the wheel of the Bel Air, turned the key, and waited. The engine coughed once, an old man clearing his throat, then coughed again, deeper this time, and on the third turn, it roared to life with a sound that cracked open something ancient in his chest. It wasn't just an engine starting, it was a voice coming back from silence, a life speaking after too many years of stillness, and Archie leaned back in the seat, eyes closed, the vibrations running through his bones like a hymn remembered from childhood. Dex stood nearby, eyes wide with awe and something else, something older than his years, because even he could tell this wasn't just mechanics, it was resurrection. The neighbors gathered slowly, one by one, drawn by the sound like churchgoers who'd heard the bells after too long an absence, and stood quiet at the edge of the driveway, hats in hand, not out of shock, but out of respect. They watched as Archie eased the car forward, the wheels catching on gravel like they remembered the feel of the earth, and slowly rolled to a stop under the big oak tree where Mildred once sat, sketching flowers into the margins of her books. Inside the glove box, Dexter had placed the journal, wrapped now in soft cloth, next to the matchbook and the note she'd written all those years ago, a small shrine, hidden in plain sight, riding forward into a future she'd never get to see. Archie stepped out, his knees creaking but his eyes clear, and turned to the boy beside him, who had become something more than a neighbor now, something closer to a witness. And then, without any fanfare, Archie reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded map they had pieced together from the journal, the photo, and the testimony of a man who'd carried too many secrets, and said the words that shifted everything again. "Dex, what would you say if I told you we're taking her all the way to Elk Pine?" Dex didn't answer with words, not at first, not because he didn't know what to say, but because sometimes the weight of a journey settles over you before the first mile is even driven, and all you can do is nod, quietly, as the road ahead starts whispering your name. He stood beside Archie, the smell of motor oil still clinging to their clothes, the sun casting long shadows across the gravel, and in that moment, neither of them were thinking about miles or maps or what they might find at the end. They were thinking only about going, and how going sometimes matters more than arriving. 2 days later, the Bel Air stood center in Archie's garage, lifted on jacks, stripped of old paint and grime, waiting like an altar prepared for something sacred, something final, something beautiful. It was Dex who found the original paint code, written in a long-forgotten maintenance book tucked inside an old tackle box, and it was Dex who pointed to the swatch-marked Sky Mist Blue 1960 Special Edition, and said with absolute certainty, that's the one she'd want. They painted the body themselves, layer by careful layer, sanding between coats, breathing in the scent of lacquer and memory, the soft hiss of the spray gun sounding like rain against a window pane you hadn't opened in years. It wasn't just about color. Not really. It was about returning something to the world the way it had once been, Before time and sorrow had their say, before loss did what it always does, steals quietly and never all at once. When they finally peeled back the masking tape and stepped away, the Bel Air shimmered beneath the shop lights, not like something new, but like something restored, a soul polished back to its truest self, gleaming in the exact shade of the Montana sky the day Mildred said yes. Archie didn't say much that evening, just walked slow around the car, fingertips grazing the fender like a man remembering the shape of a prayer he used to know by heart. And when he finally met Dex's eyes, he smiled. Not wide, not loud, but real. The man in the hat returned just before dusk, holding a package wrapped in canvas. Inside, a radio he had pulled from the trunk of his old Studebaker, modified and tuned, still able to play the stations out of Calgary, where the signal stretched just far enough on clear nights. They installed it beneath the dash, right where the old dial had been, and when they turned it on, the first sound it made wasn't music. It was static, sharp, and honest, like the voice of the past clearing its throat, about to speak again. Then, slowly, the static gave way to a melody. Sam Cooke, live from some long-ago stage, his voice floating through the speakers like it had never left, like he'd been waiting patiently all this time to be heard one more time in this car, by these people. The moment held them all. Archie, Dex, the man in the hat, and even Bruno, who lay by the open door with his head resting on the cool floor, his ears tilted just slightly, as if the music reminded him too. And just as the last notes of the song faded into the summer night, the garage filled not with applause or words, but with something stronger, something still. Because now the car was ready, not just to run, not just to be driven, but to carry something. Something that couldn't be mailed, emailed, or said over the phone. Something that had to be brought, by hand, by heart, to the one place where questions still waited, quiet as pine needles falling in forgotten woods. Dex looked at the map again, tracing the route with his finger, then asked, softly but clearly, Archie, what happens if we find him? What happens if Norcross is still alive? Archie didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the question reached into a place he'd kept sealed tighter than any glove box or trunk, a place where the weight of what-ifs and unfinished business lived side by side like quiet roommates. He looked at Dex, the boy who had grown more in 2 months than most do in 2 years, and said, if Norcross is still breathing, then he's been carrying something heavier than both of us, and he deserves the chance to set it down. And so they packed. Not much, just what mattered. A small duffel with tools, a flask of coffee, Bruno's blanket, and Mildred's journal wrapped in a dish towel that still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old Sundays. Before dawn, the Bel Air rolled out of the driveway like it remembered the way, its engine humming low and steady, the radio playing a mix of static and song, as if the car itself had a soundtrack it refused to forget. They drove north through the wide-breathing fields of Montana, past windmills that creaked in rhythm with the years, and roadside diners that looked like they hadn't changed since Archie first kissed Mildred behind one, on a dare, in '59. Dex kept the map unfolded in his lap, eyes scanning every bend in the highway, every faded name printed in ink too old to trust, his finger pausing on each lake and landmark like a priest thumbing through verses in an unfamiliar gospel. At one gas station, an old man with a face like folded leather and a sheriff's badge pinned crooked to his vest leaned in to admire the Bel Air, his eyes narrowing when he saw the Montana plate from 1964 mounted on the bumper. He asked where they were headed, and when Archie answered, Elk Pine, the man's jaw tightened slightly, not with fear, but with recognition, like the sound of a name you thought you'd never hear again. You're looking for Norcross, he said, not as a question, but as a truth already confirmed, and then he leaned in close, eyes flicking to Dex with something between warning and respect. If you find him, he said, voice a gravel whisper, you ask him what he left behind at Station 11. And tell him Annie made it to the other side. They drove the rest of that day in near silence, each man lost in a different kind of storm, the kind that doesn't shake trees or rattle windows but shifts something behind the ribs, where belief and doubt keep quiet company. By twilight, they reached the trailhead where the road narrowed into gravel and then into dirt, a path barely visible beneath decades of pine needles and fallen branches, the kind of place that doesn't welcome visitors so much as test them. Archie eased the car to a stop beneath a bent cedar tree, its trunk warped like it had once leaned into his secret and decided never to straighten again, and stepped out with the care of someone walking onto sacred ground. They followed the old forestry trail on foot, Archie with the journal in one hand and Bruno padding silently ahead, his nose twitching with every breath, as if the very scent of the truth still lingered in the underbrush. When they reached the ridge overlooking the lake, Elk Pine, just like in Mildred's sketch, Dex gasped, not because of the beauty, though it was there, wild and untouched, but because nestled beneath the trees, just past the reeds, stood a cabin with smoke curling gently from its chimney. Archie nodded, not in surprise but in confirmation, like this was exactly where the road had always led, no matter how long it had taken them to arrive. They approached slowly, respectfully, and when they reached the porch, Archie knocked, not loud, not hesitant, but like a man saying, "I'm still here, and I never forgot." The door creaked open, and there he was, Elias Norcross. Older than memory but not broken by it, his eyes still sharp, his back still straight, and in his hands, a leather pouch stained with age and sealed with a wax stamp neither of them recognized. He looked at Archie, then at Dex, and said, "I wondered how long it'd take for her to send you." Archie narrowed his eyes, every muscle in his jaw tight with the tension of years held in silence, and asked the one question that still haunted every page of Mildred's journal. "What happened at Station 11, Elias? And why did she think you were the only one who could tell it right?" Elias Norcross stepped aside without a word and motioned for them to enter, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of weight a man carries when he knows that some stories, once opened, will never again let a soul sleep the same. The cabin smelled of pine sap and old tobacco, with paper maps thumbtacked to the walls, coffee stains on a desk that hadn't seen a typewriter in years, and a single photo resting on the mantel Mildred, younger than Archie, remembered, standing in the snow with a folder clutched tight against her chest. They sat in silence for a long moment, the three of them plus the boy who'd followed the trail not for himself, but for the sake of a promise he hadn't made, but now carried with a weight well beyond his years. When Elias finally spoke, his voice had that graveyard gravel to it, the sound of someone who hadn't said a name aloud in decades, and wasn't sure if it would burn or bless. "Station 11 was real," he said, eyes focused on the fireplace where no flame yet burned. "But it wasn't what they told you, not a fuel depot, not a weather outpost. It was a memory vault, a place where the government stored things they didn't want remembered." Dex leaned forward, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and the kind of awe that only truth can stir, like realizing the old stories weren't just stories after all, but warnings dressed in fiction. Archie stayed quiet, his hands folded over Mildred's journal, waiting for Elias to finish, not because he doubted the man, but because he already knew the story's shape, even if he hadn't yet heard the final words. Elias reached for the pouch on the table, broke the wax seal with the tip of a pocket knife, and spread out its contents, photographs, typed reports, and one audio reel labeled in red grease pencil, "Testimony, February 5th, 1944. The government was experimenting with psychological warfare," Elias said, unfolding a report so yellowed it crackled like dried leaves. "They were building profiles of people with memory so sharp they could replicate maps from a glance, mimic entire conversations days later, and Mildred, she was one of them." Dex's eyes widened, and he turned to Archie, who now stared not at the documents but at the floor, as if the truth had stepped into the room and made the walls too narrow to breathe. "She never told me," Archie said, the words barely making it past the lump in his throat. "All those years, and she never said a word." "She couldn't," Elias replied, softer now. "They made her sign a recall order, swore her to silence. But before she left that program, she stole a set of names. Survivors. People who had suffered in those tests, and she kept them safe. Some of them fled here, to Elk Pine. I helped hide them." "And the journal?" Dex asked, glancing at the worn book like it had just changed shape in his hands. "She encoded directions," Elias said, "and the margins, and the sketches. Every trip she took with Archie was part of a network, revisiting the safe houses, checking the records. But then Station 11 went dark, and the files vanished." Archie's breath came slow, controlled, but his hands were trembling now not out of weakness, but because he finally understood. The Bel Air wasn't just a car. It was a vessel, a carrier of memory, a quiet rebel that had outlived its keepers. "I thought we were just escaping," he whispered, "driving north to start over. I thought it was just a goodbye trip." Elias placed a hand on Archie's shoulder, firm but kind, and said, "She let you think that, because you gave her peace. And in return, she left you the map to something bigger than either of you." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the pines like applause too old to remember its purpose, and Bruno stirred near the door, as if even the dog sensed the weight of history pressing down like fresh snowfall. When the sun dipped below the ridge, casting the lake in a gold too soft to last. Archie stepped outside and stood by the Bel Air, now glowing like something sacred under the sky. He reached into his coat, pulled out the keys, warm from his pocket, and placed them in Dex's hand, not with ceremony, not with speeches, but with the quiet grace of a man who finally understood that what he started would not end with him. "This is yours now," he said. "Not just the car. The story. The burden. The light." Dex looked at the keys, fingers curling around them like they were something precious and alive, and then looked back at the man who had taught him to listen, not to the noise of the world, but to the silence beneath it. "What do I do with it?" Dex asked, his voice steady, but his eyes full. And Archie, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the water met the trees, said the last words of the story, the ones Mildred had never written, but somehow had left behind all the same. "You drive, and you remember." Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.